Voilà. Zo, aan mij komt de eer toe om onze eerste spreker in te leiden. Zet je schrap. Oog om oog, tand om tand. Ons strafrecht steunt nog steeds op retributie, ofwel vergelding. En dat gaat als volgt. Als mensen iets verkeerd doen, moeten ze worden gestraft. En dan denken we ook nog vaak, die straf moet ook nog eens in verhouding staan tot wat ze hebben mispeuterd. Volgens onze eerste spreker, Gregg Caruso, is dit een misvatting. We hebben eigenlijk geen vrije wil en we kunnen dus ook niet verantwoordelijk worden gehouden voor ons handelen. Maar niet gevreesd, Caruso stelt er een ander en volgens hem beter alternatief tegenover. Een aanpak die efficiënter is, humaner is en niet uitgaat van straffen. Professor Gregg Caruso is filosofieprofessor aan de Universiteit van New York en stichtend lid van het Justice Without Retribution Network. So, that was my introduction in Dutch. Dear Professor Caruso, we're all ears. Welcome to our annual Night of the Freethinker, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this. I'm honored to be part of it. Let me just share my screen if I can. Oops. Let's see if I share my screen. Apologies, hold on. Does that work? Yep. All right, well, thank you. So my talk today is on rejecting retributivism, free will punishment and criminal justice, which is also the title of my most recent book. So the goal of the talk is I'm going to begin by just briefly outlining what the retributive justification of punishment is, for those who may not be familiar. I'm going to then explain some of my reasons for rejecting retributivism. In the book, I developed 6 distinct arguments against retributivism, but tonight I'm going to just focus on 2 of those arguments, the 2 that have to do with free will. But in the book, there's 4 arguments that are against retributivism that are independent of the concerns I'll talk about tonight. And then I'm going to outline my alternative to retributive punishment, which I call the public health quarantine model. And if there's time, hopefully I could take a few questions. Okay, so let me just start out with a definition. So one of the most prominent justifications for legal punishment, I should say both historically and presently, is what's called retributivism. So the retributive justification of punishment maintains that absent any excusing conditions like mental insanity or some exculpatory considerations, wrongdoers are morally responsible for their actions and deserve to be punished. And they deserve to be punished in proportion to their wrongdoing. So for the retributivist view, wrongdoers deserve something bad to happen to them simply because they've done wrong. And that bad thing could include pain, deprivation, all the way up to the death penalty. Sadly, United States, we still have the death penalty. There's 2 things I want to bring out about the retributive justification of punishment. One is that it's purely backward looking. So that means it's not reducible to consequentialist or forward-looking considerations like safety or deterrence or future moral formation of the agent. I'll say something about that more in a moment. And it's grounded in the notion of desert. So for those who are not familiar, I don't mean deserts or what we have after dinner. I mean desert in the sense of the punishment that one deserves. So perhaps the best way to bring out these 2 features is with a famous quote from Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher. He was a retributivist, and he gives this classic example. He says, imagine an island society, and this island society is going to disband, and all of its members are going to scatter around the globe. And there's one remaining prisoner in prison. And he asks, would we be justified or even required to punish this offender before the last person left the island? Now, in the example, the last person in prison is a murderer, and for Kant, the only fitting punishment for a murderer was the death penalty. And so in the quote, he says, even if a civilized society resolved to dissolve itself with the consent of all its members, as might be supposed in the case of a people inhabiting an island resolving to separate and scatter themselves around the world. The last murderer lying in prison ought to be executed, he says, before the resolution is carried out. And this ought to be done in order that everyone may realize the desert of his deeds. So in this example, you get both the concept of desert, i.e. this person deserves to be killed before everyone leaves the island. And note that it's purely backward looking, meaning you're not executing this person because it's going to make society safer. There's no one left to protect. You're not executing this person to deter others. There's no one left on the island to deter. You're not executing this person for their own moral formation, because in this case, you're executing them. There's going to be no benefit to their moral development. You're simply punishing them because it's backward looking. They did some wrong and they deserve to suffer for that wrong. So that's a key component of the retributivist justification of punishment. Here's just a modern retributivist. Probably one of the best known legal scholars who defends this view is Michael Moore. And this quote captures very nicely these two features I'm highlighting. So he says, retributivism is the view that we ought to punish offenders because and only because they deserve it. So we have to give them their just deserts. If you've ever heard the phrase just deserts. And then he says, well, punishment may have these forward-looking benefits, but they don't form any part of what justifies the punishment. So he says, well, punishment may deter future crime, incapacitate dangerous persons, educate citizens in the behavior required for civilized society, reinforce social cohesion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yet, and this is the key part, he says, for retributivists, these are a happy surplus that punishment produces and form no part of what makes punishment just. For retributivists, deserved offenders should be punished even if the punishment produces none of these other surplus good effects. So punishment may have these secondary benefits, but for the retributivist, that's not part of the justification. Okay, so the question I'm concerned with is whether or not the retributive justification of punishment is ever justified. And as I said, I'm an anti-retributivist, and I've argued a number of different things against the retributive view. But again, tonight I'll focus on only two of these arguments. So one reason to think agents do not deserve to suffer for the wrongs they've done in this purely backward-looking sense I just described is that they're not free and morally responsible in the sense required. So this gets us into the issue of free will. So I'm a free will skeptic. This is the view I've defended now in a number of books. So as a free will skeptic, I maintain that who we are and what we do is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. I'll say something about what those factors are in a moment. And because of this, we're never morally responsible in what philosophers call the basic desert sense, the sense that would make us truly deserving of praise and blame and punishment and reward. That is, the free will skeptic denies we have the kind of free will and the kind of moral responsibility that would be needed to justify retributivism. Now, for some people, the thought of free will skepticism is a frightening one. They think it's going to lead to nihilism or despair, or we're just going to have to let criminals run free, or it's going to negatively undermine meaning in life. And so in my work, I've been systematically going through these different domains and arguing for an optimistic view of skepticism. So I call myself an optimistic skeptic. I maintain that the prospects of meaning in life and sustaining good interpersonal relationships could be maintained. And although retributivism and certain severe forms of punishment, say like the death penalty, would have to be given up, there are alternatives that, in my view, are more humane and more effective. So not only do I think we could live without the belief in free will, I actually think there's some benefits to giving up the belief in free will. So I'll come to some of this in a moment. I'm not going to go into great detail about my arguments against free will tonight because it would take up too much time, but I'll just say very briefly what some of the arguments are. In the past, the main concern for free will was determinism. So determinism is the thesis that facts about the remote past, in conjunction with the laws of nature, entail is only one fixed future. And so historically, philosophers have argued that if determinism is true, it's incompatible with free will, either because it's incompatible with the ability to do otherwise, which some think is a necessary condition for free will, or it's incompatible with the agent being the ultimate source of their actions, because the source drains back to antecedent conditions beyond the control of the agent. I'll say that in my own view, I am officially agnostic about the truth of determinism. My view is a little bit different. I maintain that while determinism is incompatible with free will and the kind of moral responsibility needed for, say, retributive punishment, so too is indeterminism. So indeterminism wouldn't help the agent preserve moral responsibility any more than determinism would. So this is the most technical slide, and I apologize. If anyone wants to ask me more questions about this during the Q&A, I'm happy to answer them. But this is just briefly my argument against free will. Basically, I argue that all the major views, all the major avenues for preserving free will independently fail for different reasons. And as a result, free will skepticism remains the only rational view left standing. So against the view that free will is compatible with the causal determination of our actions by natural factors beyond our control, i.e. against the view known as compatibilism, I argue that there's no relevant difference between this prospect and our actions being causally determined by manipulators. It's a very famous argument. Again, I could go over it later if the people are interested. But I also present a second sort of independent argument against compatibilism that maintains that regardless of the causal structure of the universe, forget about determinism and indeterminism for a minute, free will and moral responsibility are incompatible with the pervasiveness of luck. So this is a kind of argument based on luck, and there's two kinds of luck here that are relevant. There's what's called constitutive luck, and that's the kind of luck that makes us the agents we are, the kind of luck that makes, affects our constitutive nature, determines our psychological predispositions, our habitual likes and dislikes. So this is the luck of the lottery of life, who your parents were, how you were raised. And luck is beyond the control of the agent. These are factors we don't control. And then there's what's called present luck, luck around the time of action. This could be the luck of whether your mind wanders at the right moment or the wrong moment, what motivational states become most salient in your deliberations. It could be the luck of situational features of your environment. And the argument is that the combination of constitutive luck and present luck swallow all. And that constitutive luck and present luck are each undermine the kind of free will and moral responsibility I'm talking about. And because of this, agents aren't morally responsible, whether or not it's because of the reasons of determinism, indeterminism, or luck. Against what's called event causal libertarianism, which is a kind of libertarianism that posits indeterminacy just in the sequence of events, I argue that those accounts can't preserve the control and action that's needed for free will, because the agents are unable to settle which outcome occurs. And then there's another kind of libertarianism, what's called agent causal libertarianism, that posits a more robust notion of agency, where an agent is a substance, not reducible to their physical makeup. And as a substance, they're able to cause events, but that these agents are little uncaused causes. They're the cause of their own actions, but themselves uncaused. In my view, that view would preserve the control and action needed for free will. Unfortunately, it doesn't fit with our best philosophical and scientific theories about the world, and it also faces additional problems accounting for mental causation. So as a result, I maintain that the best view to adopt is free will skepticism. And again, this is the view that maintains that what we do and the way we are is ultimately the result of factors beyond our control. And now we could see that those factors can include determinism, indeterminism, or luck. And because of this, we're never morally responsible in the sense that is needed to justify retributive punishment, the purely backward-looking, non-consequentialist punishment that's grounded in the notion of just deserts. So the big implication of this view is that free will skepticism is inconsistent with the retributive justification of punishment. It does away with the notion of desert. And because of this, retributive punishment, I maintain, lacks justification. Now, you might not be sold. And if I had more time, maybe I could sell you on the rational arguments that favor free will skepticism. But even if you're not convinced, I think there's a second argument, a slightly weaker argument that requires, I should say, not a weaker argument, but an argument that only requires a weaker kind of skepticism that also undermines the retributive justification of punishment. And I call it the epistemic argument. And it basically says that the burden of proof is on the individual who wants to intentionally inflict harm on individuals to provide good justification for doing that harm. And that the retributivist can't satisfy this high epistemic standard. So here's the argument, basically. Legal punishment intentionally inflicts harm on individuals. And if you think about it, especially in the United States, it inflicts a great deal of harm when you think about things like mass incarceration, the loss of liberty, the length of our sentencing. So punishment involves intentionally imposing this punishment on an individual. And if we're going to intentionally cause harm to individuals, we have to have good reason, good justification. So if it's significantly probable that one's justification for harming another is unsound, then at least prima facie that behavior is seriously wrong. That is, if I were to wrong you with, or intentionally harm you, I should say, without good justification, that would seem at least prima facie to be wrong. Now, what's the retributivist justification of punishment? Well, it maintains that agents are morally responsible in this basic desert sense, and hence they justly deserve to suffer. That's why we're going to punish them and intentionally inflict harm on them. Yet the justification for claiming that agents are free and morally responsible in this sense faces powerful and unresolved objections. And just to think about it in simpler terms, the debate about free will has waged for over 2,000 years, and there's no clear consensus about it. And so there's sufficient doubt. There's sufficient doubt that agents have the kind of moral responsibility that would justify a system of criminal justice that seek to intentionally harm wrongdoers on the assumption that they deserved it. And because we should, restrain from intentionally inflicting harm on individuals when we lack good justification, my argument is that we should restrain from engaging in retributive punishment because it doesn't reach the high burden of proof that's required to justify that such harm. Okay, so if you reject retributivism, either for those reasons or others, and as I said in the book, I lay out 4 additional reasons for rejecting retributivism, and I wish I had time to go over these. We have to figure out what do we replace it with. So critics complain that adopting the skeptical perspective is going to leave us unable to deal with criminal behavior, and that the responses it does permit are insufficient for acceptable social policy. And I argue that's not the case. And so in the new book, I essentially develop a model and spell it out in a lot of detail over several chapters, but I'll do it briefly now, what I call the public health quarantine model. And it has a quarantine component and what I call the public health framework component. So here it is in its simplest form. Free will skeptics claim that criminals are not morally responsible for their actions in the basic desert sense, and that's simply because nobody is morally responsible in this particular sense. But many carriers of communicable diseases are not responsible in this or any other sense for contracting their diseases. So let's say I get in a plane to fly to Belgium to give this talk in person, and when I get off the plane, I test positive for Ebola. I think everyone would agree that the state would be morally justified in quarantining me. And the justification for quarantine would not appeal to free will or moral responsibility or retribution or just deserts. The basic justification for quarantine would be grounded, at least in my model, on the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others. That the state would be justified in restricting my liberty to protect, essentially, public health and safety. And I argue that an analogous account can be given for the incapacitation of seriously dangerous criminals. That is, we could justify incapacitating, not punishing, incapacitating, restricting their liberty, seriously, violent offenders, child molesters, serial killers, repeat violent offenders, on the grounds of the right of self-defense and prevention of harm to others, analogous to the justification we have for quarantine. And we could justify incapacitating them without appealing to free will or a controversial notion of desert or to retribution or to any of the controversial notions that I just discussed. So it's an incapacitation account grounded in the right of self-defense. However, if we adopt this model, a number of really important reforms follow. So just to quickly mention a few, as less dangerous diseases would justify only preventative measures less restrictive than quarantine. On this model, less dangerous criminal tendencies would justify only more moderate restraints. So what does that mean? Well, it means we don't quarantine people for the common cold. If I were to sneeze on you and you were to get sick, I've caused you some harm, but we don't think quarantine is suitable for all cases. We restrict quarantine to very precise, very restrictive, very special cases. And so on my model, I argue that we should adopt what I call the principle of least infringement. We should adopt the least restrictive measures possible that are consistent with protecting public health and safety. So this means that when we talk about who should be incapacitated, on my model, many of the reasons we currently incarcerate people for, we shouldn't incarcerate people for. So over 64% of inmates in prison in the United States suffer from a mental illness, 64%. It's higher among women. 75% of women have a diagnosable mental illness. Many of them would be better served with mental health services. Vast majority of people in the United States that are currently imprisoned are imprisoned either for drug possession or crimes due to addiction. Many of them would be better served with drug treatment. Many low-level nonviolent crimes, I argue, would be better dealt with by alternative means. And so incapacitation should be restricted to very rare, very special cases where it's absolutely necessary. My model is also consistent with the decriminalization of many of the things we currently incarcerate people for, like possession of marijuana. Second, my model demands a degree of concern for the rehabilitation and well-being of criminals. So let's say you held me at the airport because I have Ebola. Well, the story doesn't end there. You have a moral duty to treat me and then release me the minute I'm no longer a threat to society. You lack any continued justification for holding me the minute I'm no longer a threat to public health. And so on my model, the focus of the criminal justice system should be rehabilitation and reintegration. Lastly, if a criminal can't be rehabilitated and our safety requires indefinite confinement, this account provides no justification for making their lives more miserable than it's required to guard against the dangers they pose. Meaning, when we quarantine the Ebola patient, the state is justified in doing that, i.e. restricting their liberty, but they're not justified in stripping them of their other basic rights, of stripping them of their voting rights, of disenfranchising them, of preventing them from getting housing. So in my view, you could justify incapacitating the seriously dangerous criminals that we need to, but they should retain their voting rights, their basic humanity. They should be treated with dignity and respect. And so on this model, we could justify the restriction, but we can't justify voter disenfranchisement, housing disenfranchisement, and dehumanization as exists in many current prisons, at least in the United States. All right. That said, I know I'm running out of time, but 5 more minutes here. That said, I want to shift the focus from the myopic obsession with punishment to prevention and social justice. And this is where the public health framework comes in. So my model places this quarantine analogy within the larger justificatory framework of what's called public health ethics. And the approach of addressing, say, violence or criminal behavior from a public health perspective provides a number of benefits because the public health framework is already focused on aspects of prevention and social justice. So let me just say a little bit about each of these. In the book, I have a whole chapter dedicated, I should say, to identifying what I call the social determinants of health and criminal behavior. And I argue that the social determinants of health are essentially analogous to the social determinants of criminal behavior. So we already know things like poverty and low socioeconomic status can affect poor health outcomes. People in poverty have higher rates of morbidity, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, a number of health complications. Well, the same is true with incarceration. In fact, one of the greatest predictors of incarceration is socioeconomic status. We also know that abuse and exposure to violence can affect health outcomes, but it also is correlated with incarceration rates. So just think of this one statistic. 90% of women, 90% of women who are currently imprisoned in the United States have previously been victims of violence. Domestic violence, sexual assault, rape, child molestation. And the effects of that violence have affected their ability to function. In fact, abused women tend to have higher levels of unemployment. And because of the psychological effects of the abuse and the inability, let's say, to hold steady jobs, they might end up engaging in certain criminal behaviors as a consequence of that abuse. Well, the best way to prevent these outcomes from occurring is to address the social determinants, to address poverty, abuse, exposure to violence, housing insecurity, mental illness, poor environmental health, educational inequity, nutrition. And in the book, I explain how each of these factors plays a major role in producing criminal behavior. That crime is more a byproduct of circumstances than people. Of course, on the tail end, if you have a seriously dangerous offender, we have to protect society. And so I have this quarantine analogy, this incapacitation account. But I want to move us away from this obsession with punishment to prevention. Instead of a reactive approach to crime, I want a preventative approach to crime. And this is essentially what the public health framework does. It identifies the social determinants of crime, it prioritizes them, and then it targets them through social policy. And there's a number of examples of this in programs like in Scotland, certain pilot programs in South America, and even some pilot programs in the States, both in New York and Chicago in particular. So I'd be happy to talk about these, but it's very important that we focus on what the causes of the criminal behavior are. The second and last aspect is the social justice component. And this is very much in line with the public health framework in general. So when you think of things like infant mortality rates, they tend to be higher in developing countries than in developed countries. So if you look at infant mortality rates in India, they're much higher. And when public health institutions are trying to address that health inequality, what they often discover is the underlying causes are issues of social justice. So it might have to do with women's rights, women's lack of access to birth control or reproductive control over their own bodies, or access to education or work training. Literacy rates are extremely low. I think it's around 20, maybe 30% among women in India. So to address the poor health outcomes, you have to address the underlying structural injustice. And the argument I want to make is that the same thing is essentially true with the social determinants of criminal behavior, that we can't successfully address and reform the criminal justice system without simultaneously addressing issues of social justice. And so this is a much broader and holistic approach to criminal behavior, which focuses less on individual responsibility and more on the structural features of crime. And it sees individuals as embedded in social systems and tries to address the societal and social causes of the criminal behavior in the first place. So in conclusion, the public health quarantine model is not only consistent with free will skepticism, that is, it doesn't appeal to any questionable notions that the skeptic rejects. It's also ethically defensible, and in my view, it is more humane than retributivism. Additionally, once we reject the retributive and purely punitive approaches to criminal behavior, we can move away from this myopic focus on punishment and embrace a more holistic approach. that prioritizes prevention and social justice. It's like if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Well, if you view everything through the lens of individual responsibility, the appropriate response to crime is punitive, punishment. But if you approach things more holistically, you see that individuals are byproduct of circumstances. And that, yes, we have to deal with the violence and the threats that that violence poses, but it's best to also focus on the systemic causes of criminal behavior. So retributivism and purely punitive approaches to crime remain, I think, a stumbling block in our way to progress, since they typically see criminal behavior as a matter of personal responsibility and desert. So my last thought here is, I think, by abandoning the belief in free will, and with it, what I think is the pernicious idea of just deserts, giving individuals what they deserve, we can look more clearly at the causes and more deeply at the systems that shape individuals and their behavior. And this will allow us to adopt more humane and more effective practices and policies. Thank you very much. Happy to take some questions now.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's see. We have a couple of questions from the audience. First question, Hilde asks, regarding your view on free will, responsibility, and punishment, how does your view relate to raising children?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, sure. So one of the things, if I had more time, I would discuss this aspect, is that the skeptic doesn't reject all notions of responsibility. There are non-controversial notions, like causal responsibility. I mean, Hurricane Katrina was causally responsible for the destruction of New Orleans, nothing to do with free will. But there's also what we call attributability responsibility, where we attribute characteristics to individuals. And then there's what's called answerability responsibility. And this is where I think parenting comes in with children. So let's say my daughter gets in trouble in school. She does something bad that I don't approve of, and so she comes home. The skeptic says that instead of adopting a kind of responsibility grounded in desert, grounded in blame, and backward-looking, blame and resentment and indignation, we can engage in what are forward-looking kinds of moral exchanges. So I could ask my daughter, why did she perform this action? What factors led her to engage in it? What features of herself might be, causally responsible? Maybe there's aspects of her own personality she could acknowledge are flawed, that she could work towards refining or developing moving forward. So what the skeptic would say is that instead of a backward-looking system grounded in blame and resentment and indignation, we could adopt a forward-looking approach grounded not in basic desert, but in three non-desert deseratum, in particular, safety, reconciliation, and future moral formation. We care about the moral formation of our children, and so we can engage in moral exchanges, a kind of moral protest, for the forward-looking purpose of weighing their scales when they consider future actions moving forward. And they could work toward developing and changing aspects of themselves. Of course, reconciliation is a forward-looking feature where we want to reconcile with the wrongdoer, maybe because we want to maintain a relationship with the wrongdoer. And then safety, which of course I talked about with regard to my own model of criminal justice. So I think that when it comes to parenting, my view is it actually works more effectively, pedagogically speaking. I think it's more effective to express reactive attitudes like sorrow and disappointment in my daughter's choice than moral anger. It tends to be more effective, I realize. Moral anger could be corrosive to our interpersonal relationships, and especially, I think, to the parental relationship with children. So,
okay, thank you. A second question, Jan Willem asks, if there's no free will, how can a brilliant liar manipulate his victims? Since for doing this, he has to be able to adjust his behavior constantly to the reaction of his victim and at the same time keep his goal in mind.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything inconsistent with that and the denial of free will. I think some people have a mistaken view what the skeptical view is. We don't deny, A, that people change their minds. We don't deny that reasons can factor in people's decisions. I don't deny that by giving philosophical arguments, I'm giving you reasons for believing something, and reasons are causes. Reasons are things I could exchange with you, arguments, justifications, philosophical arguments against free will, whatever it may be. And those are aimed at changing and causing a change in your beliefs, in your, doxastic states. I don't deny that there's degrees of agency. I just deny that the kind of agency that we have is a kind that's sufficient to hold agents responsible in what I call the basic desert sense. So I think a skilled liar is just using their ability to mind read the other person, track what they're believing, and feed them information in a way that is intending for them to have a false belief. The more pertinent philosophical question would be, what's the motivation for the lying and the manipulating? What's the moral considerations that are going into it? And I would argue that those are largely a byproduct of the individual's constitutive character. But as I said earlier with the topic of luck, I think that our own constitutive characters are largely a byproduct of factors beyond our control, namely luck. That who we are and the kind of people we are and the kind of motivational states that drive us are the byproducts of factors ultimately beyond my own control. This is not to say people can't change their minds. This is not to say that rationality or reason has to be thrown out, nor is it to say that agency itself doesn't exist. Of course, I acknowledge a distinction between an eye twitch and choosing to make a cup of coffee. People make choices. I just don't think they make free choices. I think that the motivational states and the deliberations that lead to the choice are the byproducts of one's internal psychology, and that psychology is the result either of deterministic causes or luck, or even if it's indeterministic, it's still not ultimately within the control of the agent.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I don't think we will have time for all the questions. What about the effects on the victims when your strategy is implied? Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I myself worried about quite a bit is, what is this? How does this address victims and victims' rights? I have a whole chapter where I address this in the book. And one of the things, well, I say a couple things there. One, there's actually recent studies, and I don't know if I have the ability to share my screen again real quick. There is a study. Let me see if I can do this. Can you see this? Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is a study that was done by the Alliance of Safety in 2006. It's the largest study on victims and what victims want. And I was actually really startled by how much this fits with my own view and how little it has to do with retributivism. So like by 2-to-1 margin, victims preferred, can't see what that says because it's behind something. They want a system that's focused on rehabilitation more than punishment. By 15-to-1, victims prefer increased investment in schools and education over investment in prisons and jails. 10-to-1, they prefer increased investment in job creation over prisons. 7-to-1, victims prefer increased investment in mental health treatment over investment in prisons. Basically, they want prevention programs and programs that fund preventative measures that address the social determinants. And I really love this one. 6 in 10 victims preferred prosecutors considered victims' opinions on what helped them recover from the crime, even when victims did not want long prison sentences. They thought that the tough on crime DAs, for example, weren't, oops, where am I? How do I get back to my screen? Did the screen go away? Let me just stop sharing.
We can see your screen, but
okay, stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah, so, it's back. Yeah.
So, so it turns out victims want something more in the line with what I proposed than what retributivists proposed. And I think the real reason there is they want they want other people not to be victimized, and they realize the best way to do that. The second thing I would just very quickly say there is, even if victims wanted excessive punishment, it doesn't necessarily mean that we would be denying them their rights if we didn't dole out extreme punishment. So let's say someone had their car stolen, and in exchange, they wanted to see the perpetrator's hands cut off. Even a retributivist might say, well, that's disproportionate punishment. That's cruel and unusual. And denying the victims what they want wouldn't be a violation of justice, because justice only demands giving them what they deserve, or what is fair, or what is right, or what is justified. I would just argue that the whole retributivist justification is not justified. And so if the punishment isn't justified on philosophical grounds, I'm not denying the victim any rights by doing something that would violate justice itself. They could only request what would be fair or just in the first place. If they require some extreme, form of punishment that violated principles of justice, we're not denying them their rights. If I say, no, sorry, we're not going to cut off his hands. And so if they wanted harsh punishment, it wouldn't necessarily be a violation of their rights if we didn't give it. But that said, it turns out that's not what they want.
All right, thank you. I'm sure for many of the other questions, perhaps people would have to read your book to find an answer to their questions. Thank you very much, Professor, for sharing your time and your lecture with us. We hope to see you live in the flesh, hopefully in the future. But thank you very much anyway.